cyber attacks are a problem. I don't need to tell you that. But people don't really understand how big of a problem they actually are. Ooh. Perfect. Okay, so back to business. In 2023 alone, we are set to lose $8 trillion globally to cybercrime. That would make cybercrime the third largest economy in the world if it were a country, succeeded only by the US and China. It's about double of Japan's economy. Businesses bear the brunt of a lot of these costs. The average cybersecurity breach costs about $4.5 million US. Some breaches cost a lot more than that, with Optus costing about 140 million and Medibank costing about 50 million. Recently, there was a breach for Move It. So Move It is similar to Dropbox. A lot of businesses use it to share files. And that was breached in June of this year. And this hack is still ongoing because obviously a lot of businesses kept confidential information in those files. So this one breach through Move It has spawned 600 subsequent breaches and affected at least 60 million people. That is a lot of people. That's twice Australia's population and then some. So you can imagine how much this one breach is costing, and it hasn't stopped yet. It's still going on right now. It's not limited to organizations. Critical infrastructure is also suffering from these breaches as well. You'll probably be familiar with Colonial Pipeline in the US. It wreaked havoc on fuel distributions across the United States, which had knock-on effects to distributing things like food and medicine to places that needed it most. The Florida water treatment plant hack, you might not know about this one because it wasn't actually successful, but if it was, it would have raised the chemical composition of the drinking water to unsafe levels. It would have been deemed unsafe for human consumption. You might be more familiar with the Waikato District Health Board attack. Unfortunately, I don't know if you were affected by that, but you might be more familiar. Where essentially ransomware was deployed against the Waikato District Health Board, which resulted in people's surgeries being delayed, chemotherapy being delayed, and we don't know yet. It never got revealed, but we suspect that maybe patient files were also compromised. It's also become a classic move in, I'm ahead of myself. So here we have a graph, and this represents the amount of critical infrastructure attacks over time. And we can see that there is a big uptick around 2018 and 19, and it's just ever increasing. And in the next few years, it's set to just keep going up. It is not slowing down. In August alone of this year, there were 20 successful known cyber attacks against critical infrastructure globally. That's important because a lot of cyber attacks don't get discovered immediately, and sometimes it can take months to discover a cyber attack. So, and it doesn't even account for attempts as well. These are just the successful ones. Cyber attacks have also become a part of global warfare and statecraft. Russia was behind cyber attacks in the lead up to the Ukraine invasion. They used it to destabilize the nation. They launched cyber attacks particularly against power grid infrastructure and banking infrastructure to really wreak havoc on society there, and to lower the people's overall confidence in the government to protect them. So in response, Ukraine fostered the Ukrainian IT army. This is actually not an army in the traditional sense. This is an army of vigilantes globally that have organized to launch cyber attacks against Russia in response to its invasion of Ukraine. So not only is this part of statecraft, but we've branched into guerrilla cyber warfare, essentially. Our democracies are also at risk. There's been a number of attacks against democratic infrastructure. The 2016 presidential election was interfered with to an extent by attacks from Russia. What does this have to do with human behavior? Well, human behavior plays a role in 95% of cyber attacks. It's not necessarily the sole reason for cyber attacks, but it's often used to gain a foothold. Everyone's familiar with phishing attacks. Everyone knows about your Nigerian prince emails, or Bill and Melinda Gates want to give you a whole bunch of money. Those are one of the most common attacks, and they prey on the flaws of human cognition. and the ability to differentiate between legitimate and illegitimate emails. Backups as well, backups and updating your software. If your files are not backed up, as I'm sure some of you might be aware at the moment, you may not have access to them if something goes wrong. In terms of updates, I'm not just talking about updating your personal laptop or your desktop computer. I'm also talking about entire organizations functioning on legacy software, including things like Windows 7 and even Windows XP. It is very hard to update global, like across the organization, it's very hard to update software. Again, some of you might be aware of it. So with the Waikato District Health Board attack, they were using Windows 7, which stopped being supported for security updates. Any flaw that is discovered after it stops being updated is now open forever. There's nothing you can do about it. The reason that they were still using Windows 7 was for software compatibility issues. So it's not a straightforward task to update organizational software, but it does leave them open to these kinds of problems. Passwords. Everyone has to use passwords for everything. And we're always constantly encouraged to use complex, unique passwords for every single service. And we have to remember all of them. And people are lazy, essentially. People don't use good passwords. And if your password is leaked online through a separate breach and you happen to reuse that for a different service, especially if you use the same email address or username, you are now susceptible to attacks on all those other services that you use that login information on. So human behavior has a big role to play in cyber attacks. And people know what they should be doing. We know we should be doing these things. We know we should update all our software because it's no longer being supported. We know that we should be using complex passwords. And we know that we should be probably not clicking every single link that we get in our email. But this is exhausting. Doing this all day, every day is exhausting. And a lot of us don't do it as often as we should. And people do know how to behave. So here we've got the human aspects of information security questionnaire. Each one of these focus areas had 9 questions on a 5-point Likert scale. So these means are quite high. They're in that top, 15 to 20% a lot of the time. So people do know what they're meant to be doing, but it doesn't necessarily always translate well into actual behavior. An example of this is the privacy paradox. So the privacy paradox is that despite being concerned about their privacy, users will still disclose private information. And this is particularly relevant for Facebook and things like Google, because you might think that, no, I don't do that. I don't disclose all my private information online. But if you post on Facebook, or even if you have a Facebook account, they're harvesting your private data. Same with Google. If you use Gmail, I also use Gmail. They look through your emails and make targeted ads based on that data. I also feel the need to clarify that this is not actually a paradox in a literal sense, because if you take into account other decision-making aspects, it actually makes rational sense. It's not paradoxical. So people will do this if they believe that risk is low and there's a convincing reward for doing so. People notoriously will give up their information for discounts. Us poor and starving grad students might do that a lot. So today we're going to go over 4 different aspects of human behavior in cybersecurity. First, we'll look at why do people fail to act securely. We'll look over modeling cybersecurity behavior. Then we're looking at motivating better practices and where to from here. So let's start with why people fail to act securely despite knowing better. We're going to start with the theory of human error. So the theory of human error acts to explain some errors that may occur despite having the knowledge of how to correctly behave. So we have 4 different types. We've got slips, lapses, mistakes, and violations. Violations are a unique one that I'm not going to talk too much about today, but I'll get to that in a second. So slips and lapses are accidental errors, whereas mistakes and violations are deliberate errors, and this will make more sense as we go. So an example of a slip. So slips are generally often mechanical in the sense that you're doing something. And an example of a slip could be misclicking. Sorry. An example like that. So a slip can be misclicking or misinterpreting. So if you open your email, you're tired, it's first thing in the morning, you've just rocked up to work, and you're trying to differentiate, like, is this email okay? Can I click on this link? Can I download this attachment? And if you while you're trying to register whether it's safe to click, you accidentally click on it and you're like, well, too late. That's a slip. Another slip is if you might be aware of the SolarWinds hack that happened somewhat recently, I think 2021 now. What happened is you'll hear a lot about it being poor password practices because the passwords for SolarWinds were SolarWinds 123, which, yes, that is terrible password practices, but that's not what was wrong. What actually happened is they were backing up their code to a public GitHub repository, and they were storing the password in plain text. So it was not hashed, and it could be easily read and used. So yes, bad password, but also an accident. They overlooked that. So they knew that that was a problem, but they didn't notice it. So that's a slip as well. A lapse is more when you intend to do something and you just don't eventuate. There's no actual mechanical error happening there. It's just that you fail to carry it out. And that can be through forgetting, like, did I update that thing or did I just think about it? Or source monitoring errors. Security is incredibly repetitive. We do the same things over and over and over and over again, and it's very easy to sometimes think you've already done something when you actually haven't. So these are accidental in the sense that we know what we should do, but we don't carry through with it for whatever reason. We also have deliberate errors. So these are mistakes and violations. These are when you think you're doing the right thing, but it doesn't actually translate into secure behavior. So mistakes, they can happen through misunderstandings or lack of knowledge. So for example, if some very nice man from Microsoft calls your grandmother and says, I'm sorry, but your computer has 10 viruses that we need to do something about this. Can you please log in and give me access to your computer? She might do that because she thinks she's doing the right thing. She thinks, wow, there's a virus on my computer and I know viruses are bad. This nice man wants to help me. Well, this obviously she's just letting the hackers in, and in the meantime, they're draining her retirement funds. So this is a misunderstanding or a lack of knowledge causing this lapse where you think you're doing the right thing, but you're not. Violations. So violations are when you know you should be doing what the right thing is, but you still don't do it. And this could be through laziness or convenience. Like I said, security is repetitive. It's not exactly the most fun thing we do every day. So you might feel like it's getting in the way constantly of the tasks that you're doing right now. So I'm just going to do the easiest possible thing. Another one, violations, is insider threats. So insider threats is where you have maybe a disgruntled employee. They decide that their company has not treated them very well, so they're going to launch a cyber attack from within that company. These are very rare. They don't happen very often at all. But when they do, they are the single most devastating type of cyber attack because there's nothing unusual about it. An employee is accessing their internal systems like they have permission to do. It's not an external actor. It's someone who has permission. So how can we combat some of these errors that occur? Well, with slips and lapses, we can combat some of them through good usable design. And usable design takes into account cognitive and perceptual psychology to try and make it intuitive for people to use UIs, usable interfaces. So one way is through security indicators that communicate the status of the system. You might be most familiar with the HTTPS symbol in the top corner of your browser. That will tell you whether that particular website is secure or not. It's intuitive in the sense that it often has a symbol that you can really quickly interpret, but it's not intuitive in the sense that it's often out of your field of vision and you're not necessarily looking at it. More modern browsers or more secure browsers will give pop-ups that say, actually, this website is insecure. So it's in your face and it actually interrupts what you're doing. So it's a bit more perceptually intuitive. So that comes under pop-up warnings. And you'll get pop-up warnings for things, for insecure emails sometimes, or for the software updates, especially security updates when they release like an urgent update. They're like, you have to do this right now or you're at risk. These reminders as well will help reduce the instances of lapses as well. So if you're forgetful and you get a reminder, like, remember, update your software, you're more likely to do it. The problem with this though is it can induce automation bias. So automation bias is your over-reliance on a computer to tell you what to do, essentially. This is also very common in aviation and health because they have a lot of systems that tell them when they should be doing something. And if that system doesn't actually kick in and give you that warning, you might not do anything about it because you don't use your own cognitive processes and intuition to actually make a decision. We have some examples of poor usable design as well. So poor usable design can hide important information, and this is my biggest pet peeve at the moment with email clients, is you'll have the email, like the username, where it's who is actually sending you an email, but you don't see the email address behind it. Anyone can make this username and send emails as that. When you're not able to actually see the email address it's coming from, it's an extra barrier to you making a good decision or not, because you might not initially realize that that email is not actually coming from that usual contact. It's someone masquerading as them. It creates barriers to basic tasks. Poor usable design, if you're getting a lot of notifications that are not necessarily important and they're trying to force you into making decisions, your security is not your job, and it shouldn't be your job. Security is my job, and it's the IT department's job, and you just want to get through your emails like you do every other day. And if you keep getting these notifications, it just gets frustrating and you try and avoid them instead. Forcing frequent decision-making induces security fatigue. So that's where you are kind of desensitized to these notifications and these alerts and these threats. You're like, yeah, I've heard it 1,000 times. I get it already. And you're not likely to take it as seriously. So usable design is useful for slips and lapses, but it's not overly useful for modeling mistakes and violations. So we'll look at modeling cybersecurity behavior now to better understand mistakes and violations. To do that, we're going to use mental models. So mental models are essentially your internal representations of complex concepts that help you understand the world around you. So you might understand how electricity works through the idea of how water flows. It's not one-to-one, it's not exact, but it's how you help understand it. A mental model can be formed through a variety of different concepts. So through analogous thinking. So a password is like a lock on your front door. They both stop intruders getting in. So you think of a password like a lock, and that helps you understand it. Metaphors, a hacker is a burglar. Yeah, more or less. And through experiences, and this is one of the most important ones. So through anecdotes, through the media, your own experiences, which is not ideal when it comes to cybersecurity, but we'll get to that later. And expert interactions. So taking the analogy of an engine, to you, your mental model of an engine might be the very expensive light that comes on your dashboard. Or you might have a slightly more developed understanding of an engine, so you have a rough idea of what it looks like and what it does. Or you might be an expert and it's quite advanced. So mental models exist on this spectrum. Alternatively, though, you might never have seen a car before and you have no idea what an engine is, in which case you don't have a mental model at all. So let's take a look at some examples of mental models that exist in cybersecurity. So this is mental models of hackers and how people understand what hackers do and how they are a threat to them. So an underdeveloped sort of model is hackers are vandals and their actions are just inconvenient. This is underdeveloped in the sense that there's no threat. They don't feel a sense of threat from hackers. They're just kids messing around, essentially graffitiing. A slightly more developed model is hackers are burglars looking to steal my data. Sometimes they are, in the sense that this is more developed in the sense that they see a threat there. It's likely to induce some kind of action to protect themselves, whereas if they're just vandals, it's like, oh, it's fine. I'll be able to fix that anyway. They're not going to do anything more than that. A more advanced model, so this is still a user model, so it's not in that highly technical sense, but hackers are contractors that support criminals. And this is the most accurate model that we've got up here, because a lot of hacking groups are not just that shadowy figure that you see, on the media, and it's just wearing a hoodie in someone's basement, typing on a computer. That is not what a hacker is. Hackers are often organized crime syndicates. And this was established pretty well when the ransomware group Conti, it's a well-known Russian ransomware group. They had a disgruntled employee who released a whole bunch of their internal communications. They had conversations about pay disputes, about disliking their colleagues, and how the organization that they were working in functioned. They functioned similarly to a business. And their entire model was selling ransomware, essentially, to launch against. They would sell ransomware to less technically savvy people who would then use it against their target. It was a business. So let's look at models of viruses. So as we talk about more and more technically advanced cybersecurity concepts, people's mental models get less and less developed. So these ones are quite grouped down the end here. So a very underdeveloped model, viruses are bad. They don't know why. They don't know what viruses do. They just know that they're not good. Another one is viruses are just buggy software and are not malicious. It's arguable about whether this one is like more developed or less developed, I guess, because at least viruses are bad. They feel some sense of threat. But here they don't even, they're just like, oh, it's just a software bug. It's nothing dangerous. It's fine. And a slightly more developed model here is viruses support crime. Again, this is more developed in the sense that they can see more consequences than a lot of these other lower development models. An even more advanced model, again, might differentiate between different types of malware and viruses as well, because there is quite a range of them. And our last one, mental models of HTTPS. Most people don't have one. Most people have no idea what it does or what it means. And as a result, people often underestimate, distrust, and ignore the status indicator, which is a problem because they're not protecting themselves. They don't actually know what they're in for when they go into an insecure website, and they don't know what that actually means. So these are some of the ways that we can explore how people understand cybersecurity concepts and understand why it is they make the decisions that they do. In some of these, you can see that a lot of people don't generally feel very threatened by something. Not likely to produce very effective behavior in that sense. Or they just have a general misunderstanding of how something functions. In terms of what an effective mental model looks like, incorrect does not necessarily mean insecure. Users don't need to be experts. Like I said, it's not your job. We don't need them to know how every little thing works. And I'll go over an example of why that is in a moment as well. Incorrect mental models can still produce effective behavior. And a good example of this is malware doesn't harm my files, but it steals my information to send to hackers. Like, yeah, it does. But it can also harm your files in the sense of ransomware, where you can never access all your information again and you lose all your precious family photos and valuable tax information in case you get audited next year. So while this is not necessarily correct, it does mean that people will carry out protective behavior because they don't want to be a victim of identity theft. They don't want to be stalked or harassed online because someone's found all their personal information. So they're more likely to do something about it. Accuracy does not necessarily make it effective. The example I've got here is the Sydney City Rail map. You might not be very familiar with this, that's fine. So this map is very good for getting from A to B, but it's not geographically accurate. It doesn't give you the topography of Sydney. It doesn't tell you where the mountains are or where the national parks are. And that's fine because that's not its purpose. So more information does not necessarily make it more useful. If we suddenly had all of these, the topography features on this map, it would start being not very useful for getting from A to B. And these lines would become much more complicated than simple straight lines. So it's not necessarily very helpful. In terms of updating mental models, I went over a bit of this previously in how they were formed. But updating mental models essentially requires accurate information and conveyed in a way that people can understand as well. It can't be highly technical. Like I said, that's not their job. It needs to be in a way that people understand. Personal experience is one way that mental models can be updated, but that's not ideal. We don't want people to be victim to a cyber attack to have to learn from it. That's the opposite of what we do here. Another one is feedback and consequences. So sometimes you can do something wrong, but nothing bad necessarily happens, and that's okay. But without those consequences, someone might not necessarily learn from that. So having, the supervisor on hand or your boss to come around and say, or the IT department to say, that's fine that nothing bad happened, but this is what could have happened. And this is why we're not going to do this in the future. We're going to do it this other way. Cybersecurity awareness training and education is another way. You might be familiar with these. I know I've been made to do so many cybersecurity modules at all different workplaces, including university. These, unfortunately, a lot of these awareness training programs are not based in any level of science. They're not tested for effectiveness, and they're often highly simplistic and don't account for the way that people already understand cybersecurity concepts, which is what those mental models were about. They often make an assumption that users understand cybersecurity in the same way that experts do, but just less. And that's not necessarily right. And intuitive usable design, like we were talking about earlier. So moving beyond mental models, unfortunately, this is a very under-researched field. Behavioral cybersecurity, there's like not much research whatsoever. It's very new. And most of the research that does exist is mental models. It's usually very qualitative. And that's fine. It helps us get a very good understanding of what people understand about cybersecurity, but we're still lacking a lot of things. So with my research, we wanted to move beyond this. We wanted to look at it in a different kind of way. And to do this, we looked at protection motivation theory. You don't need to memorize this framework. That's okay. We'll talk through it. It's just to frame the research that is coming up. So in a broad sense, protection motivation theory states that to engage in a protective behavior, we will take our knowledge of the threat and undergo a cognitive mediation process. And during that cognitive mediation process, we will form an overall estimation of a threat, as well as our ability to cope with the threat. So that is our threat appraisal and coping appraisal. These two things together act to inform our intentions here and our behavior. These two things are separate because intentions don't necessarily always translate into behavior. I know I was intending on going on a low-carb diet and that didn't work out. Or if you intend to go to the gym first thing on a Monday morning, that doesn't necessarily turn out either. Some of the things we spoke about today already fit into this model as well. So in the knowledge aspect, we have mental models, mistakes, and general training and awareness campaigns. That contributes to that knowledge section of this model. And our slips and lapses and usable design fit in that gap between intentions and behavior. So we have that full intention to behave securely. We might accidentally slip or have a lapse, and therefore it doesn't translate. So break this down to more bite-sized chunks so that we can go through it in more detail. To form an overall estimation of a threat, we will consider the severity of the threat, how much we perceive that severity. So this is not actual severity, it's just what we know about it. And perceived susceptibility. So that's how much at risk we are personally from that threat. If we take a non-cybersecurity example, I might feel like heart disease is terrible. Yeah, that's going to do a lot of damage to some people, but not me. So that would be high severity, low susceptibility. This is offset by rewards for certain behaviors. And then that translates into your overall estimation for that threat. In terms of the coping appraisal pathway, we have self-efficacy and response efficacy. So self-efficacy is how effectively you think you can carry out a certain behavior. Do you find cybersecurity very difficult to do physically? Is it really hard for you to remember all of those unique complex passwords? That comes into self-efficacy. Response efficacy is how effective you think that behavior is at protecting you. I can do everything right and still somehow I end up part of a breach. Therefore, none of this is effective and not worth doing. These are offset by the costs of the behavior, and in cybersecurity, sometimes the costs can be quite cognitively high. So it takes a lot of effort and sometimes a lot of time to figure out what you should be doing, how to do it, what it actually all means. And sometimes some cybersecurity software and measures cost money. If you use a password manager, there are free ones out there, but sometimes they cost money, and that can't be afforded to everyone. So this acts to then form your coping appraisal. And again, these things then form your intentions and your behavior. So now I'm going to look at motivating better practices. So keep that self-efficacy pathway in mind, the coping appraisal pathway, because that's what this following research is based on. So let's get straight into that. Prior to figuring out whether we could motivate better practices, we needed to figure out whether we could measure them. So that is, can we measure people's self-efficacy and their intentions, and then figure out how that affects behaviour? So can self-efficacy and intentions in cybersecurity be measured? To do this, I developed 3 new surveys: the self-efficacy and security survey, which is just called security, the behavioural intentions in cybersecurity scale, the BICS, and the feelings of inspiration. So the feelings of inspiration, that's just like a confounding variable for how motivating, or not motivating is not the right word, but how inspiring you find the particular activities that you're required to do. Essentially, how much do they care about it? If they don't care about the activity, they're not going to engage with it very well. I also use these 2 existing surveys as confound checks as well. We have the Human Aspects of Information Security Questionnaire. We had a look at that a little bit earlier as well, which consisted of the knowledge, attitudes, and habits subscale, and a modified version of the Threat Perception Index. So the Threat Perception Index was initially made for the basic conventional terrorism threat, but it was slightly modified to reflect cybersecurity more specifically. In terms of results, we found some great correlations. So these are the main correlations that we're looking at. We ended up with 3 reliable and effective scales. So we had alphas of 0.85, 0.91, and 0.88 respectively for these. And the security scale had 12 items, BICS had 13, and inspiration had 5. We found that security and intentions correlated to 0.5, which is essentially what we expected, really high correlation. And we can see that knowledge in general, knowledge, habits, and attitudes, the HACE-Q, correlated significantly with both intentions and self-efficacy. Interestingly here, our threat perception index correlated with intentions but not self-efficacy, which is what we expected. If you look at that protection motivation theory again, threat and self-efficacy are on 2 separate pathways that don't cross. So that was expected as well. So essentially, we now have our measures that we can then use to figure out whether we can drive self-efficacy up and therefore intentions. So now we needed to know, are self-efficacy and intentions malleable? Because at this point, we did not know whether we could actually manipulate them. In that previous study, we actually had a very subtle manipulation procedure that did not work. So in this following study, we decided to throw literally everything we had at it. So we did a pre and post manipulation measure as well as between groups. So we had a control and experimental group only, and the experimental group was focused on driving up self-efficacy. So prior to the manipulation, they completed the security and BICS surveys. They completed a filler task to make them forget what they said in those first surveys. And then we did our manipulation. In our manipulation, we gave them false feedback. So we gave the increased group false feedback, but not the control group. And that false feedback said essentially that they performed worse than their peers in these 2 surveys to try and motivate more, like pursuing more knowledge about something rather than just having that false confidence. We used episodic thinking, which I'll go over episodic future thinking shortly as well. We gave them information and we gave them quizzes based on that information. In the control group, they were given study tips, whereas in the experimental group, they were given cybersecurity tips. In our post-manipulation measures, they completed the security and BICS again. They completed the HACE-Q knowledge subscale, but not any of the other ones. We wanted to keep it short so that we didn't lose too many people along the way. We gave them a modified locus of control scale as well to look at their general feelings of control about the world, to see if that had an impact on self-efficacy specifically for cybersecurity, and our inspiration scale as well. For self-efficacy, we found that there was a significant difference between groups over time. It doesn't look that big here because they cross over, but you can see that in the experimental group, the self-efficacy was lower in the pre-manipulation measure than the post-manipulation measures, while the control group stayed the same throughout. So it was effective at increasing self-efficacy. Now for behavioural intentions, again, we see a nice textbook results. There was no difference in control pre and post, whereas in the increased condition, we had a nice big increase. So now we know we can manipulate it. However, obviously, there was a lot of things going on in that manipulation procedure, and we don't know which aspect of it specifically was effective. So we decided to focus specifically on episodic future thinking, which I'll go over in this next slide, to see if that can be used to change self-efficacy and intentions. A little bit on episodic future thinking. It's a form of prospective thinking that can be used to generate mental simulations of a potential future event. So it's not about the past, it is about the future, and it is about something that we give them a nice vivid explanation on what they should be imagining. The control group in this scenario was given past-oriented events, so not future thinking and not about cybersecurity. It was just general, what was your last holiday like? I'll give you some examples of that in a moment. Episodic future thinking uses previous experiences to construct this hypothetical future scenario. Not necessarily related to cybersecurity, but it could be using other mental models to construct this future scenario a bit like a puzzle. In the past, it's been used to modify smoking and eating behaviour, so we know it can be used to change behaviour. We just don't know whether it can be used to change cybersecurity behaviour specifically. In our manipulation procedure, like I said, our experimental group had a future-oriented cybersecurity scenario, and the control group had a past-oriented general scenario. So in the experimental condition, they had 5 scenarios, and same in the control condition. One example being, considering the content of your emails, such as your history of purchases, subscriptions, communications, account details, and authentication emails, how would it impact you if your emails were accessed using your leaked details and posted publicly? Whereas the control group got asked questions like, think about the last holiday you went on, think about the destination, whether it was domestic or international, what kind of climate it was, and what your favorite activity was, and they were asked to describe it briefly. Our materials, again, we had our security scale and big scale and inspiration, knowledge subscale, and locus of control. We chose to omit the threat perception index at this point because it didn't correlate with self-efficacy. And those are the 2 variables, self-efficacy and intentions being the 2 variables of interest. And because it didn't correlate with both of them, we decided to exclude it. We try and keep our surveys as short as possible to avoid losing people along the way. For our results, here we have self-efficacy. There was a significant difference between the control and experimental group where self-efficacy was a lot higher. So we know that, yes, we can manipulate self-efficacy with episodic future thinking, and we can also do it with behavioural intentions as well. So here we can see there's a significant difference between the control and experimental group for behavioural intentions. Yes. So covariates. There was no difference for self-efficacy when accounting for knowledge or general feelings of control. So that means so it essentially means that people need to be inspired and a little bit knowledgeable to have that manipulation work. And there was no difference for self-efficacy or intentions when accounting for inspiration. So the interesting thing here is knowledge had no effect on intentions where it did on self-efficacy. But inspiration accounted for differences in both. So at this point, we know, yes, we can manipulate it, and yes, we can drive it up. But what we didn't know is whether we could drive it down. We didn't know if there were any particular situations in which would make people feel more hopeless and then therefore less likely to actually carry out these good behaviours. To do that, we implemented essentially the exact same method as before. I've grayed out the increased in control conditions because they're very similar to the previous ones with some very small edits to try and equal out the length and complexity of them. So we'll focus specifically on the decreased condition, which is our new condition, where we tried to drive self-efficacy and intentions down. So unexpectedly, I've also bolded the keywords that I've kind of changed between these 2 scenarios. The scenarios were kept exactly the same, but in the decreased condition, I essentially tried to maximize hopelessness and take away some of their options. So unexpectedly, the hackers have hijacked your social media accounts. They're making embarrassing posts and comments that your friends, family, and colleagues can see. They are messaging your friends and family, asking for personal information and money. They have access to your messages and are sharing screenshots of other private conversations. You've tried changing your login and multi-factor authentication details, but you can no longer access your accounts. So this takes away some of those easy options that you'd have from recovering from this attack by saying you actually can't log in. It's hopeless, don't try. So yeah, in terms of results of materials, we also added in our threat perception index again, simply because in that previous one, we still had a difference for behavioral intentions when accounting for knowledge in self-efficacy, where that didn't happen with intentions. So there was something else also driving up intentions. And considering that protection motivation theory model, we suspect it may have been threat. So we added that back in just to make sure what we were getting was accurate. In terms of results, this didn't turn out as expected. This didn't replicate our previous findings, unfortunately. So here we have no significant difference for self-efficacy between the three groups. You can see the increase is slightly up. Slightly up, but not enough to be significant. Luckily, we did get a significant difference for behavioral intentions. It wasn't quite in the direction that we expected, and it wasn't quite replicating our previous studies as well. So here you can see that the decreased condition has increased intentions, but actually this increased condition, there's no significant difference between control. And decrease is also in the wrong direction than what we expected as well. We were expecting it to be down, but instead it was up. So our current working theory, aside from some issues with data collection that we were having, is that any type of future thinking may drive intentions up, which would explain why decrease is higher despite trying to maximize that hopelessness. We're not sure why this didn't replicate. This data is very fresh. It only came in this month. So we haven't had a chance to go over it with a fine-tooth comb and figure out exactly what's going on here. So stay tuned and hopefully I'll have updates for you. Covariates. So there was no difference for intentions for when accounting for inspiration, which was like our previous studies, so that was expected. There was no change in self-efficacy when accounting for inspiration, so still no difference, which was different again, but then again, we didn't have that significant difference to start with. So, and there was no changes in intentions or self-efficacy when accounting for knowledge, feelings of control, or threat. So in summary of this particular research, in our first study, we found that self-efficacy and intentions can be measured and they can be manipulated in that second study. In our third study, episodic future thinking increases self-efficacy when they're knowledgeable and have greater feelings of control. Intentions increases regardless of knowledge or feelings of control. And in our last study, they can't be decreased with episodic future thinking, at least so far. I'm hesitant to make any hard conclusions on the study, given that it didn't replicate. But further analysis is required, again, because it's very fresh data. So what we know so far, cybersecurity behavior can be understood through the theory of human error, mental models, and protection motivation theory. And better behaviors may be enabled through better usable design, education and training, though it needs to be more based in science, and mentally simulating hypothetical actions and consequences through episodic future thinking, though the relationships seem complicated there at the moment. So we've gone through why people fail to act securely. We've looked at how to model cybersecurity behavior and motivating better practices. So where to from here? In terms of my research, my future directions, aside from further analysis, I need to examine longitudinal effects, assuming we can get that to replicate again. Does it persist over time? Does increasing intentions drive better behavior? Like I said earlier in that protection motivation theory model, it doesn't necessarily translate. So can we get any level of increase out of behaviors with these intentions? And application to the real world. I'd really love to get an opportunity to see how this can be translated into a real world context, perhaps through an organization or at university as well. In general, in the field, we need more multidisciplinary research. There is, like I mentioned before, most of the research that exists is on mental models. We are lacking quantitative research and we're lacking variety in the qualitative research that exists out there. And to do that, we need a multidisciplinary approach. In implementing research from organizational psychology, forensics and criminology, cognitive science, security studies, and defense. What does the future of cybersecurity in general look like? Well, that's firstly a very big question. It evolves in ways that we don't expect, and that's the entire nature of cybersecurity. Things get used in ways that we don't expect they will be. Cyber warfare being a big one. Like I mentioned earlier in our talk, Russia and Ukraine are essentially engaging in guerrilla cyber warfare as part of their tactics. Disinformation is a big problem at the moment as well. It's very big in the playbook of Russia. They're very typical for using disinformation, but other nations use it as well, where they are manipulating people to distrust their governments and to just distrust science. COVID was a massive turning point for disinformation, where it became extremely serious, extremely fast, because people stopped trusting scientists and science. And understanding how this disinformation is used, there are so many psychological aspects that could be looked at here. The misinformation literature that's used a lot in the eyewitness literature is very relevant to this. The Internet of Things, a lot of people don't really understand the Internet of Things. So the Internet of Things is things like your Google Home, your robot vac, or your air purifier that connects to the internet, or your fridge that you can see what's in it when you're at the shop so that you can see what you need to buy. All of these things are connected to the internet, and people don't understand the security implications with that. And they often don't have very good understanding of how it works at all. Again, that comes into some of our mental models, but also more research is needed to understand how people understand these things, how they secure them, etc. And of course, we can't leave out artificial intelligence. It's been all the rage the last 12 months. Artificial intelligence is, not only can it be used to defend against cyber attacks, but it can be used for offensive purposes as well. If we can tie that into disinformation, I'm sure the people who created ChatGPT didn't realize that it could be used to create and disseminate massive amounts of radicalization propaganda or disinformation in general. And with automation bias, when we're using artificial intelligence to defend ourselves against cyber attacks, we entrust a lot of the decision-making over to artificial intelligence without using our own intuition. So taking into account that things are becoming increasingly automated, how can we encourage better security and minimize automation bias? And just as a refresher, this field is not getting any smaller. Cyber attacks have been on the rise for a long time. These ones are against critical infrastructure specifically, and you can see that there's no slowing down. It's just going to keep getting worse. As more and more things become connected to the internet, again, Internet of Things, and more things become reliant on digital infrastructure. Election infrastructure is now often digital, and there have been attempts to sabotage elections through that digital infrastructure. So it's incredibly important, because not only is this on an individual level, but it's on an organizational level and a national level. Eventually, everyone will have a breach story. The figures that I've shown you today, that's inevitable. It will be on every level. It will be on, like I said, it'll be on individual, organizational, national. We are losing millions, trillions of dollars every year, and it's going to get worse. And the last 30 years, all we've heard over and over and over again is that humans are the weakest link in security. But the truth is that we are the first defense. We are the first line. Technology is made by us, for us, and it's broken by us. We are the intersection of all of these things. With this field and with this research, we can encourage people to do better. And we should, because we can still turn this around, and we can still mitigate the risks that people are facing in the years to come. Thank you.